Hey guys, tonight we descend into the world of medieval justice, if you can even call it that, where fairness was optional, splinters were guaranteed, and you probably won't survive this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. I love seeing our little night owl map light up across the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The air smells of cold iron and damp straw as you walk through the heavy oak door of a castle dungeon, your footsteps muffled by centuries of spilled secrets. You can hear the low drip of water somewhere, an echo bouncing off stone like a heartbeat that forgot how to stop. This is not the romantic, candle-lit version of the Middle Ages your favorite fantasy shows sold you. This is the part where the justice system comes with a side of mildew and moral panic. You breathe in, cautiously, because even the air feels accused of something. The jailer eyes you like he's appraising a loaf of bread. Is it stale enough to throw away, or still worth keeping? It's said that dungeons back then weren't just for prisoners. They were also for storing confessions, usually squeezed out the old-fashioned way. There's one mainstream historical fact every historian agrees on. Medieval punishment wasn't only about pain, it was about public theater. Each punishment was a sermon in steel and sweat, meant to teach the village that stepping out of line meant stepping into the stocks, or worse, the ground. You pass a row of iron chains, each thick enough to anchor a ship, and a rack that looks suspiciously like an over-enthusiastic yoga device gone rogue. A torch flickers on the wall, its smoke curling like an afterthought toward the ceiling. You realize how quiet it is. No screaming, no pleading, not tonight, but somehow that's worse. The silence feels full, as if the walls themselves are humming with leftover agony. A quirky tidbit that always surprises people. Medieval prisons were not meant to hold people long-term. They were just waiting rooms for punishment, like the world's worst customer service lounge, complete with rats instead of magazines. Some scholars debate whether these spaces were as gruesome as popular imagination paints them. One camp insists chroniclers exaggerated for dramatic flair. The other camp replies, "Have you seen the bones they found under York Castle?" You look down, half expecting one of those bones to wave hello. The jailer leads you deeper, mumbling about justice and order, but you can't help noticing the rats are the only ones moving freely. He points out a wooden chair with straps that seem too friendly, and you can't tell whether it's for interrogation or just a very dedicated dentist's appointment. The scent of old metal, wet leather, and hopelessness mingles in the air, making you wish you'd brought a stronger candle or maybe a lawyer. You think about how punishment back then wasn't only legal, it was moral entertainment. Whole towns showed up to watch, clutching bread rolls and moral superiority, cheering as if sin could be beaten out of a body like dust from a rug. But not everything was pure cruelty. Some punishments doubled as civic bonding events. Imagine a whole crowd booing a thief together. It's like medieval social media, except your reputation literally hung in the square. A flicker of laughter escapes you. It's absurd, but there's a strange comfort in knowing humanity has always loved a bit of spectacle. You brush your hand against the cold wall, feeling grooves where iron chains rubbed century after century, carving tiny stories no one ever read. Somewhere up above, a bell tolls for curfew, and the jailer's torch wavers as if tired too. You take a slow breath. This is where our journey begins, not in the sunshine of castles or the glamour of knights, but here, in the damp echoing heartbeat of a world where justice came in steel, rope, and rumor. As the torchlight dims, you can almost hear the whisper of those who didn't get to walk out. Welcome to the dungeon. You might want to keep the lights low tonight. You step out from the dungeon's damp shadows into the open square, blinking as the sunlight strikes your eyes like an accusation, and suddenly you're standing before one of medieval society's favorite public theaters, the stocks. Two thick slabs of weathered wood, joined by rusted hinges, sit waiting at the edge of the market square. And you realize this contraption isn't just furniture, it's performance art. The smell of roasted onions, wet straw, and gossip fills the air as townsfolk gather around, ready for their daily dose of moral superiority. A merchant wipes his hands on his apron, children giggle with sticky fingers from honey cakes, and a priest murmurs something about virtue while trying not to look too entertained. The prisoner, a tailor caught overcharging a noblewoman, kneels as the constable lowers the top plank over his wrists and neck, the wood closing with a dull thud that echoes more than it should. You can see how the crowd loves this. There's no blood, no horror, just humiliation disguised as justice. That's what made the stock so effective. They didn't kill you, they made you live with yourself and with everyone else's laughter. You imagine being locked there, face burning under the sun, unable to scratch your nose or swat the flies buzzing like hecklers. A mainstream historical fact here: the stocks were required by law in most English towns by the 14th century, a civic obligation much like having a town hall or a gossip problem. They were positioned near the market on purpose because what better way to deter petty crime than to make it an afternoon attraction between fishmongers and bakers? There's something chillingly clever about it. The punishment costs nothing but shame, and it feeds the crowd's appetite for moral order. A fringe tidbit you might not have heard. Some towns rented out the stocks overnight to couples accused of adultery, forced proximity as therapy, or maybe just cruel medieval irony. Imagine spending the night shoulder to shoulder with your scandal partner while the moon watches silently and the rats offer commentary. Scholars still debate whether this kind of punishment was genuinely about deterrence or just good old-fashioned entertainment. One theory argues that the public ritual of ridicule reinforced community bonds. Another insists it was simply cheap fun for bored villagers. Both may be true. After all, nothing unites people like mocking someone else. You can almost hear the laughter as the tailor sneezes, splattering flour from his hair, while someone throws a wilted cabbage that misses and hits the constable instead. The moment becomes absurdly human, even funny, until you realize no one will unfasten him until dusk, maybe longer if the innkeeper forgets. The town crier moves on to announce new tax rates, as if misery comes with a schedule, and you start to understand that punishment in this age wasn't always about crime. It was about control, a visible reminder that your body and reputation didn't belong entirely to you. You shift your gaze to a group of women selling herbs. They whisper to each other, eyes darting between the stalks and a nearby barrel of apples. They've seen this scene 100 times, yet they still watch, half pity, half pleasure. You think about how modern people might judge this cruelty, but then you recall the endless comment threads and online call-outs of today. It seems the method changed, not the motive. The medieval crowd might have been primitive, but their sense of justice feels eerily familiar. The sun drifts lower, shadows lengthen across cobblestones, and the tailor's shoulders sag. Someone hands him a crust of bread he can't reach. A little boy snickers, mimicking his posture. The crowd slowly thins, the entertainment spent for the day. You stand there, realizing the silence afterward is heavier than the laughter before. The stalks creak as the wood cools in the evening breeze, and you sense that in a world where reputation was survival, humiliation could be a slow execution all its own. You step closer, tracing your fingers along the grooves worn smooth by hundreds before him, and the thought lands quietly. In the Middle Ages, sometimes the cruelest punishment wasn't pain, it was being remembered like this, forever caught between mockery and mercy. You wander further into the square, past the empty stocks and the faint smell of moral satisfaction, until you see its more vertical cousin looming ahead, the pillory, taller, meaner, and designed to turn shame into a public festival. It's not a chair, not a cage, but something in between. Two thick wooden boards hinged together at face height with holes for the neck and wrists. The unlucky soul inside can't kneel or sit. They stand there, locked upright like a human signpost warning others not to cross invisible lines. Today the crowd has gathered again, because in a medieval town nothing says community quite like collective scorn. A butcher's apprentice was caught watering down ale, and the villagers treat his punishment like theater. The smell of yeast and dirt lingers as they jeer, toss turnips, and shout moral advice they never follow themselves. The local musicians even play a jaunty tune nearby, because cruelty, when given rhythm, feels less like cruelty and more like a civic dance. The pillory was common across Europe, and according to one reliable historical record, it was often reserved for fraud, slander, or selling fake goods, crimes of deceit rather than blood. The idea was simple: expose the liar by literally exposing them. No executioner needed, no prison guards, just the good old-fashioned cruelty of peers. You lean closer, noticing that this poor apprentice has tears streaked with mud, his hair plastered to his forehead, and every few minutes someone in the crowd yells something like, "Add more water now, won't you?" And the crowd bursts into laughter. You realize it's not just punishment, it's catharsis, entertainment, and a public sermon rolled into one wooden frame. A quirky tidbit you might not know: sometimes people bribed the town beadle to be placed in the pillory at a quieter hour. Just a few coins to swap a roaring crowd for an empty street. It didn't always work, though. There was always someone awake, someone eager to see justice served with a side of humiliation. Some scholars still debate the pillory's true function. Was it moral instruction or moral indulgence? One camp calls it discipline through visibility. Another simply calls it cheap fun at someone else's expense. Standing here, it feels like both. The line between justice and spectacle blurs so easily when there's laughter involved. You watch a woman in the front row throw a rotten apple that splatters across the apprentice's sleeve, and the crowd roars. Even children are encouraged to join in. It's how you raise the next generation of law-abiding citizens, by showing them that mercy is something adults applaud but rarely practice. The afternoon sun slants through the marketplace, casting long shadows that crawl up the pillory's wooden beams, and you can't help but imagine the smell, the sweat, the rot, the faint sweetness of spoiled fruit sticking to the boards. Birds land nearby, opportunistic, pecking at the mess, and for a surreal second, the whole thing looks like a painting. Man, crowd, chaos, sunlight. It's almost artistic in its cruelty. You think of the irony, how being trapped like this was supposed to cleanse the soul. Yet, in practice, it only dirtied everything else. The crowd eventually disperses, laughter echoing off stone walls like fading applause, and the apprentice remains still, too tired even to cry. You notice the priest who led the morning sermon walks by now without looking at him. That's the medieval way. Sin is everyone's business until it's not. The pillory stands silent as evening falls, a wooden reminder that shame once performed never really ends. And as the moonlight hits the square, you realize something unnervingly modern about it all. In every age, people claim to hate cruelty, but they always gather to watch it first. The next morning, the square looks deceptively peaceful, dew glittering on the cobblestones as if the night had washed away all that noise, but you know better. Justice in the Middle Ages never really slept. You turn a corner and find the whipping post, a sturdy upright beam planted in the earth like a moral landmark. It's rough-hewn, scarred from years of lessons taught the hard way, and the iron ring bolted halfway up glints faintly in the morning light. A crowd is already forming, murmuring with that eager solemnity people use when pretending not to enjoy what they came to see. The condemned this time is a petty thief, caught stealing bread, which makes you think of how absurd it is that hunger itself could be considered a crime. The constable reads out the sentence with pomp, as though he's opening a play. 12 lashes for theft, administered publicly so everyone can learn that virtue apparently resides in pain. The man's shirt is stripped from his back, his arms tied high, and the whip, A thick, knotted leather strand snaps once in the air like a warning to all lungs nearby to hold their breath. A mainstream historical fact here. Corporal punishment like this was codified into local law in most European towns by the 13th century. Records from London, Paris, and Lubeck all show that flogging was considered a civic duty as much as a deterrent. The goal was never just to wound. It was to remind every crack of leather said obedience keeps order. But there's a strange irony in watching it now. The thief looks more dignified than the people cheering. With every strike, you can feel the energy of the crowd shift. Some flinch, some lean closer, all enthralled. This wasn't mere justice, it was choreography. A fringe tidbit whispered among chroniclers says that some whipping posts doubled as meeting places after punishments ended, where villagers casually tied up horses or gossip. And imagine that, leaning your broom against a post that still remembers someone's scream. The smell of iron, sweat, and wet wood lingers, mixing with the faint sweetness of apples from the nearby market. The constable's arm moves rhythmically, almost hypnotically, and you realize the whippings had their own performance timing. Never too long, never too short, just enough to make the lesson stick without killing the lead actor. Scholars still debate whether these spectacles were believed to cleanse sin or simply externalize guilt for the community's satisfaction. One theory claims that the medieval mind saw punishment as ritual theater, a way to reset the moral balance. Another insists it was more practical, a cheaper alternative to jailing. Watching it unfold, you sense it was both part sermon, part sport, part excuse to confirm that the world still had rules. When the final lash lands, the man collapses to his knees, trembling but still breathing, and that seems to satisfy everyone. The constable announces, "Justice served," and the crowd disperses like bees after honey's gone. A woman slips him a small loaf of bread in silence, and for a moment you glimpse humanity under all that noise. You think about how pain was considered proof of repentance, as though suffering polished the soul like sandpaper. But the truth is softer and sadder. The whipping post didn't purify people, it desensitized them. It taught everyone that endurance was a virtue, and empathy an inconvenience. You run your fingers along the grooves carved by countless ropes, and the wood feels warm, almost alive, as if it remembers each confession, each plea. Somewhere a church bell tolls, and you realize how normal this was. No one questioned the logic. No one asked whether punishment could coexist with kindness. The sun climbs higher, the square empties again, and you walk on, thinking how strange it is that a place once filled with screams can look so calm afterward. Justice, in its medieval form, always preferred to look tidy once it was done. By now you've realized that medieval justice was less about solving problems and more about turning them into entertainment. And few punishments blended comedy and cruelty quite like the ducking stool. You follow the sound of rushing water down toward the village pond, where a wooden contraption juts out over the surface like a seesaw designed by someone with unresolved anger issues. It's a long beam mounted on a pivot, with an upright chair at one end and ropes at the other. And as you get closer, you can already hear the laughter of villagers gathering for the show. Today's accused is a woman said to be a scold, which in the 14th century could mean anything from loud arguments to questioning her husband's intelligence, so basically being a bit too confident in public. Two burly men secure her wrists as she sits on the chair, her expression somewhere between rage and resignation, and the crowd leans forward in anticipation. The constable declares her crime, excessive talk and disobedient tone. The audience cheers as though this is justice, but it feels more like bullying with legal paperwork. The beam creaks, ropes tighten, and with one swift pull the woman plunges backward into the pond. Splash, the cold water explodes around her, and when she surfaces gasping, everyone applauds as if she's won an Olympic medal for repentance. The absurdity of it all hits you. Punishment as slapstick. A mainstream historical fact here. Ducking stools were officially recorded in England as early as the 13th century, originally used to punish dishonest tradespeople, but by the 1500s they became tools for disciplining outspoken women, especially those accused of gossip or witchcraft. The logic, if you can call it that, was that cold water would calm their fiery temperament. You can almost hear the unspoken male chuckles behind that rule, a fringe tidbit you might enjoy. Some towns treated the event as a full holiday. Bakers brought pastries, musicians played lutes, and spectators placed bets on how many dunks it would take before the accused confessed or fainted. Some even sold tickets to front-row spots, proving that capitalism never missed an opportunity, not even at the expense of dignity. Scholars still debate whether ducking was ever truly meant to cause physical harm or if it was simply symbolic humiliation. One camp argues it was civic correction through comedy, while another insists that drownings were common enough to make it unmistakably dangerous. You watch as the woman's chair rises again, water streaming from her hair, and for a brief second she looks directly at you, calm, defiant, and drenched in something more powerful than fear. The constable yells, "Once more," and the crowd claps in rhythm, the rope tightening again, the chair swinging down into the water like the punchline to a cruel joke. The surface bubbles, stills, then breaks as she re-emerges, coughing, alive. Children laugh. Old women shake their heads. Men trade comments about lesson learned. But you sense that nothing here has been learned, only repeated. The stool creaks one last time as they haul her back onto land, soaked but unbroken, and for a moment the crowd doesn't know how to react. Maybe because she didn't cry, or maybe because defiance, even dripping wet, has a strange kind of power. You glance at the pond, its ripples fading under the gray sky, and you wonder how many voices were silenced by water pretending to teach civility. The villagers begin to wander off, already talking about supper, and the stool sits there, dripping in silence, a reminder that in medieval times even the act of speaking too freely could make you part of the evening's entertainment. The next village over greets you not with laughter but with an unnerving quiet, the kind that comes when everyone already knows who's next. In the square stands a wooden post, and beside it, hanging from a peg like a blacksmith's mistake, is something that looks halfway between a helmet and a torture device. It's the scold's bridle, also called the brank, a metal cage meant to clamp over the head of anyone, usually a woman, accused of gossiping, arguing, or disrupting peace. The blacksmith himself stands proudly nearby, polishing the iron as though it were a piece of fine art. And you realize this thing isn't just meant to silence, it's meant to humiliate. The accused, a woman in her 40s with gray-streaked hair and a stare sharp enough to cut the morning fog, is brought forward by two guards. She doesn't resist, though every muscle in her face screams rebellion. The crowd murmurs about her sharp tongue and unwomanly words, and you understand that what really terrifies them isn't her voice, it's her independence. The bridle is lowered over her head, its cold iron bars tracing the shape of her jaw, and when the small plate inside presses against her tongue, the symbolism becomes sickeningly clear. Speak and you bleed. A mainstream historical fact notes that bridles like this appeared in Scotland and England by the early 1600s, often inscribed with moral verses about obedience. Many even had small bells attached, so townsfolk could hear a scold approaching. The irony of punishing noise with more noise wasn't lost on anyone, except apparently the lawmakers. A fringe tidbit from a 17th-century diary claims that some branks were made to fit men too, especially drunkards who insulted church officials, though those examples were rare and quietly erased from most records. Scholars still debate whether the bridle was primarily punitive or symbolic, a walking warning sign for anyone tempted to question authority. One side argues it reflected a moral panic about unruly speech. The other says it was a product of fear, a society terrified of women who wouldn't play silent roles. You can almost feel the tension in the square. No one laughs, no one jeers. The punishment doesn't entertain, it unsettles. The woman's eyes flick from face to face as if memorizing every coward who watched it in silence. When the constable commands her to walk, the little bells jingle, bright and mocking, echoing through the still air. She takes each step slowly, the sound bouncing between walls, turning the town into her unwilling audience. You imagine what that must feel like. Each movement a confession you never gave. Each sound a reminder that the world preferred you quiet. The bystanders pretend to look away, but you can tell they're watching. The same way people can't resist staring at lightning even when they know it might strike. By the time she reaches the end of the square, her defiance hasn't dimmed. It's hardened into something almost regal. There's power in refusing to be broken, even when your voice has been stolen. As she's finally released, the marks of the metal linger faintly on her skin, and yet she manages to look more dignified than the men who held the key. The bridle hangs empty again, swaying in the breeze, its hollow form clinking softly like a ghost of words unspoken. You realize that in a world obsessed with control, silence was the most painful sound of all. You leave behind the quiet square and follow the smell of smoke curling through the alleyways until you find yourself standing before a small stone platform where the local blacksmith's forge burns hotter than usual. Today, it isn't horseshoes or plow blades being shaped in the fire. It's justice, or at least the medieval version of it. The crowd gathers slowly, whispering as if they're about to witness something sacred, though you can already tell it's more about fear than faith. On the table beside the anvil rests a set of iron rods, each bent at the end into a letter of the alphabet: T for thief, F for forger, V for vagrant. The air smells of scorched metal and damp wool, and you feel the heat prickling against your face even from a few steps away. The condemned man, a gaunt figure with trembling hands, stands shirtless, staring at the irons as though hoping one might spell forgiveness instead. A clerk reads his charge, stealing church silver, and the crowd shifts, uncomfortable but curious. Branding was the medieval solution to a problem society couldn't otherwise solve. What to do with people you couldn't trust but couldn't afford to imprison. A mainstream historical fact reminds you that England's Statute of Vagabonds, 1547, made branding a legal punishment, marking offenders so that every village knew their crime without asking. It turned skin into a permanent record, cheap, efficient, and horrifyingly effective. The blacksmith pulls one iron from the coals, its tip glowing orange like a miniature sun, and you hear the hiss as he presses it against the man's shoulder, the air filling with the sharp, nauseating scent of burned flesh. The man doesn't scream, maybe out of pride or resignation, and for a heartbeat the world seems to hold its breath. Then it's done. The iron returns to the fire. The letter remains, dark and raised like a signature the man never agreed to write. A fringe tidbit from an old French chronicle notes that some people try to disguise their brands with tattoos, crude ink patterns meant to turn the symbol of shame into decoration, a rebellion written in pigment. Others fled to distant towns, claiming the scars were battle wounds, though rumor always seemed to travel faster than feet. Scholars still debate whether branding truly deterred crime or merely created permanent outcasts. Some argue it functioned as a visual reminder of moral order, others that it institutionalized hopelessness, ensuring no one ever escaped their first mistake. Watching the branded man stagger away, clutching his shoulder, you can't help but think it was both a punishment so efficient it erased the possibility of redemption. The crowd disperses again, some crossing themselves, others already discussing the next market fare. You look at the iron letters cooling on the table and realize they are the alphabet of cruelty. Simple shapes capable of rewriting a life. The blacksmith wipes his hands, expression unreadable, then tosses fresh coal into the forge, the flames leaping up like applause. You think about how strange it is that pain could be bureaucratic, that justice could be stamped, catalogued, and worn like a brand name. The man disappears down the street, and for a brief moment you imagine what it would feel like to carry your worst moment on your skin forever, visible to everyone except the ones who deserve to see it most. The fire crackles softly, devouring the silence, and you turn away, realizing that in the medieval world forgiveness was a luxury few could afford, and reputation once burned never truly cooled. You wander down from the forge into the narrow streets where laughter echoes more freely, the kind that's half joy and half judgment, because the medieval world never missed a chance to turn someone's mistake into a parade. At the center of the square stands a man inside what looks like a cut-open beer barrel, his arms and legs sticking out through crude holes, his face red from both ale and embarrassment. This is the infamous drunkard's cloak, a punishment so ridiculous it feels like something dreamed up at the bottom of a pint. The crowd is loving it. Children giggle, merchants jeer, and even the town reeve smirks behind his hand as the man stumbles, trying to keep balance while the barrel clunks against his knees. The smell of stale ale, wood, and humiliation fills the air, sharp enough to sting your nose. The idea was simple. If you drank too much, you'd wear your shame. A mainstream historical fact. This barrel punishment appeared in the 16th century, especially in northern England, Germany, and the Low Countries, used by local councils to correct public drunkenness and disorder. The accused was marched through town, sweating and dizzy, forced to listen as everyone laughed their moral superiority into the wind. The concept was part comedy, part cautionary tale, and fully absurd. You can imagine the town elders congratulating themselves for inventing a punishment that cost nothing but a spare keg and a rope. The man in the barrel groans, every step a hollow thud on the cobblestones, and someone shouts, "Dance for us, good fellow." He tries, and nearly falls flat on his face, sending the crowd into hysterics. You realize that this is the medieval version of public service announcements, education through humiliation. The local baker throws a crust of bread that bounces off the barrel. Two boys chase after it like confetti. A fringe tidbit you might not know. Some records from Nuremberg describe a festive twist on the drunkard's cloak. Musicians followed the offender, playing cheerful tunes as he was paraded around the marketplace. It was called the Shanton, the barrel of shame, and towns even competed for who could create the most elaborate versions, painted barrels with inscriptions like "I drank what wasn't mine" or "Ale made me fool," a mixture of morality and pageantry, proof that medieval life never let justice get in the way of a good show. Yet beneath the laughter, there's something deeply revealing. The man's flushed face and trembling hands tell a story more about poverty than wickedness. Ale was safer than water in those days. Taverns were the only place to forget endless toil, and drunkenness often came not from vice but exhaustion. Scholars still debate whether punishments like this were deterrents or rituals of control. Public reaffirmations that the town had boundaries even laughter couldn't cross. Some historians call them collective amusements, cheap moral theater designed to reinforce hierarchy without drawing blood. Others insist they were early experiments in civic rehabilitation, a kind of forced community shame intended to reabsorb the offender. You stand there watching, and it's hard to tell the difference. The man looks up once, eyes glassy, and you see the faintest smile as if he's surrendered to absurdity. Maybe he knows that by morning the town will forget, and he'll still be here, sober, sore, and free. The barrel clangs as he's led to the fountain for the finale, where the reeve announces forgiveness provided he swear off ale for a week. The man nods solemnly. The crowd claps and the ropes are cut. He crawls out, dripping sweat, hair matted, dignity scattered somewhere on the cobblestones. The barrel is hoisted onto its side, rolling away like an exorcised spirit. You step closer and catch the faint smell of yeast and humiliation mingled in the air, and you realize how effortlessly people confuse entertainment with justice. As dusk settles, the laughter fades, replaced by the rhythmic thump of barrels being rolled back into taverns for honest use. The square empties, leaving behind puddles of spilled ale that glisten like melted gold in the lamplight. You imagine the man sitting alone somewhere now, nursing bruises and pride, maybe even chuckling to himself. The world has always loved a fool, especially one it made itself. The night breeze drifts through the streets, carrying away the scent of beer and shame together. And as you walk on, you can't help but think that the medieval idea of reform was less about changing behavior and more about making sure everyone watched the lesson being learned. The drunkard's cloak stands as proof that laughter, when wielded as law, leaves scars you can't quite see but you never forget where they rubbed. You leave the square just as the scent of ale fades behind you, and the echo of laughter melts into the dull hum of daily life, walking toward the outskirts of town where the open fields meet a shallow rise. There, creaking lazily in the afternoon breeze like a carnival ride designed by someone who truly hated fun, stands the whirligig, the medieval merry-go-round of humiliation. At first glance, it looks harmless enough. A large wooden cage mounted on a central pivot, balanced carefully on a long beam that allows it to spin when pushed. But when you step closer, the purpose becomes clear. This isn't for amusement. It's for dizziness, disgrace, and the public's afternoon entertainment. The villagers call it the whirligig of shame, and as you stand watching, a young man is being strapped inside. His crime, according to the town constable, is idleness. He skipped his labor duties 3 days in a row. In the Middle Ages, being lazy wasn't just frowned upon, it was practically treason against the rhythm of the village. Every hand was supposed to serve God, soil, or sword, and those who didn't work were seen as betraying the divine order. The boy's wrists are tied to the sides of the cage. The door clanks shut, and 2 burly men on either end grab the handles to start the spin. The crowd, modest at first, begins to gather. A dog barks, a child squeals, a woman sells roasted chestnuts to spectators. The moment feels grotesquely festive, as if mockery were a civic duty. The wooden beam creaks as the men begin pushing, faster and faster, until the boy inside becomes a blur of movement and noise. The cage hums through the air like an oversized beehive, spinning until the young man's shouts dissolve into a single slurred cry, a mainstream historical fact. The whirligig appeared in European town records during the 1500s, particularly in England and Germany, as a non-lethal disciplinary device. It was often reserved for soldiers who disobeyed orders, adulterers, or those guilty of improper conduct. Its design was laughably simple, but its effect brutal, spinning so violently that nausea, fainting, and humiliation were guaranteed outcomes. A fringe tidbit from a Saxon account mentions that sometimes the cage was placed near taverns to remind drunks of their potential future. On feast days, children would even imitate the whirligig with toy wheels, proving that shame can be inherited as easily as custom. Scholars still debate whether this punishment was truly about correction or just small-town amusement. Some argue it was a mechanical sermon on order, while others see it as an early experiment in psychological punishment, inflicting disorientation rather than blood. Watching now, you sense both motives at work. The spinning slows, the crowd claps, and the boy inside sags forward. Pale and sweating, someone tosses a handful of hay at him, the way one might toss a treat to an exhausted horse. He looks barely conscious, but the constable declares the sentence complete. The irony is thick. You punish laziness by forcing motion until sickness. He's released, stumbling forward like a newborn foal, collapsing onto the ground while the crowd disperses, satisfied with their moral exercise. The sun glints off the metal hinge as the wheel creaks to a stop, empty again. The silence afterward feels heavier than the laughter before. You step closer, running your hand over the rough wood of the cage, still warm from the spinning. The surface is carved with initials, past victims leaving their mark in quiet rebellion. Some are crudely scratched hearts, others just lines and crosses, a small gallery of resistance etched into humiliation. You imagine the dizziness lingering in their heads for hours, maybe days, the world forever tilted slightly off balance. The villagers would call that justice. A doctor today would call it trauma. You take a deep breath, the smell of hay and sweat still thick in the air. The whirligig creaks again, nudged by the wind, its motion ghostly and slow, as if haunted by its own rhythm. You wonder what it must have felt like to watch the sky spin faster than thought, to be trapped in a world that punished disorder with motion until your body gave up trying to understand up from down. A scholar once described the whirlig as the wheel of humility, a phrase that sticks in your mind as you imagine this small town congratulating itself for such inventiveness. They believed the dizziness would shake sin loose from the mind, that a spinning body could realign a crooked soul. But the truth is simpler. People liked watching things turn. The spectacle soothed something primitive in them, a need to see movement where their own lives were static. As twilight falls, the last few villagers drift away, their footsteps crunching softly over gravel. The boy who was punished now lies by the well, sipping water slowly, face pale but calm. You catch his eyes for a moment. There's no hatred there, only a strange resignation, like someone who's realized that the world's rules are too absurd to resist. Behind him, the wheel creaks once more, a sigh of wood and wind, an echo of a system that believed motion could fix morality. You turn to leave, the fields darkening around you, the stars faintly visible above the horizon, and you realize that every generation invents its own way to make others dizzy. Only the devices change. The whirligig of shame stands as both punishment and metaphor, a reminder that when people are desperate to feel control, they'll make the whole world spin until someone else falls down first. You wake before dawn to the smell of brine and tar, that mix of salt, hemp, and damp wood that means punishment day on a medieval ship. And as you climb from the dim underdeck you feel the timbers tremble under your bare feet, a rhythm that isn't quite the tide but something heavier, something waiting. Sailors move quietly, avoiding your eyes, the way people do when they know mercy has already left the harbor, and the sky ahead is pale as pewter, the sun still hidden beneath the edge of the world. The boatswain's pipe shrills once, high and sharp, slicing the silence like a knife through canvas, and the crew gathers on deck, hats off, heads low, bodies forming a rough circle around the mainmast where the cat o' nine tails hangs coiled like a sleeping serpent. You can smell oil on the ropes, the bitter smoke of pitch burning in a bucket, and you know this isn't just punishment, it's ritual. The condemned man is led forward, shirt stripped, wrists bound to the grating. He doesn't fight, doesn't speak, only stares at the deck as though he can already see the stains that will soon bear his name. The first mate reads from a scrap of parchment, voice booming against the sails, dereliction of duty, insolence, theft of rum. Simple words, heavy price. In the medieval navy, discipline was survival. One weak link meant death for all, and flogging was the hammer that kept the chain intact. A mainstream historical fact whispers through the air here. By the 14th century, maritime law across Europe permitted corporal punishment at sea without civil oversight. Captains wielded absolute authority, a floating kingdom where rope and whip replaced judge and jury. The boatswain uncoils the cat, 9 knotted cords tipped with iron beads that glint like teeth, and dips them into salt water so the strands bite deeper. The first strike cracks across the air, followed by a muffled grunt, then another and another, each blow sinking with the slow heave of the ocean beneath the hull. The ship itself seems to breathe with it, inhale on mercy, exhale on pain. Sailors stare straight ahead, their faces blank not from cruelty but from the ancient sailor's superstition that pity invites bad wind. You watch the rhythm unfold, lift, strike, retract, pause, repeat, until the pattern becomes almost hypnotic, a dark prayer offered to the gods of order. A gull shrieks overhead, circling like a priest, too curious for confession. The boatswain counts in steady tones, and when the last lash lands, the silence that follows feels louder than thunder. 2 men untie the sailor, help him to his knees. The surgeon steps forward with vinegar and rough linen, muttering something about infection, though everyone knows the treatment burns worse than the wound. The condemned staggers away, leaving thin red lines across the deck like drawn maps of regret. You think about how every sailor carries scars like secret tattoos, proof of endurance more than shame. You cross the gangplank to shore, and the world feels strange, solid, yet swaying, as if the sea's rhythm still owns your heartbeat. On land, flogging takes a different tone but the same logic. The market square is alive again. Carts creak, vendors shout, bells toll from the abbey tower, and in the midst of all that bustle stands a wooden frame much like the one aboard the ship, an upright post surrounded by cobblestones stained darker than weather should explain. The condemned today is a soldier caught deserting his watch, dragged here by two guards wearing expressions of bored necessity. The crowd keeps its distance, everyone pretends not to look, but everyone looks. The priest reads the verdict in Latin none understand but all feel. Then the whip sings again, only this time it's simpler. 3 tails instead of 9, woven from oxhide, stiffened by tallow. Each strike lands with a sound halfway between crack and sigh, and the body flinches in time. You realize the purpose is identical to the sea's version: rhythm, spectacle, control. A fringe tidbit from a French military ledger in the early 15th century records that soldiers sentenced to flogging were often forced to march a full mile afterward with drums beating behind them to reaffirm loyalty through endurance. Imagine that bleeding under a banner of patriotism while the crowd cheers discipline more than justice. The soldier collapses halfway through, dust clinging to sweat, yet no one moves to help because compassion breaks formation. You can see how the same ceremony that binds sailors to a ship binds citizens to a crown. Scholars still debate what flogging truly achieved. Some argue it functioned as a practical deterrent in societies where prisons were scarce and execution too final. Others claim it was symbolic theater, a reenactment of divine punishment meant to cleanse the soul through suffering. Both are probably right. Watching it now, you sense the fusion of religion and authority. The belief that pain could polish morality the way salt preserves meat. You follow the echoes inland where the road narrows between hedgerows and the smell of smoke thickens again. In a small village yard, a different kind of flogging takes place. Quieter, almost domestic. A miller has been caught shorting flour, and the punishment is to receive 6 lashes behind his own workshop door, witnessed only by the alderman and the parish clerk. The blows are slower, almost conversational, each one followed by a whispered admonition about honesty. The air smells of grain dust and sweat, and you understand that even small sins earned physical correction here. The medieval mind equated discipline with maintenance. The same way you'd repair a wheel or oil a hinge, you repaired a conscience by striking it until it worked smoothly again. The miller's wife watches from the doorway, her face unreadable, flour clinging to her hands like frost. When it ends, she steps forward, wipes his back with a damp cloth, and goes back to kneading dough as though nothing happened. The routine of it all feels worse than the cruelty. You think about how easily a community could absorb violence into its rhythm until no one noticed the sound anymore. As night approaches, you walk toward the harbor again. The tide is rising, the sky bruised purple and gold, gulls settling on the rigging like white punctuation marks. A sailor hums softly while coiling rope, the same song that accompanied this morning's punishment, and you realize the memory has already faded into routine. On the dockside tavern wall hangs a plank etched with rules. Swear not at officers, steal not rum, strike not a fellow. Beneath it, carved faintly, the words 20 lashes for forgetting. You trace the letters with your fingers. They feel smooth, worn by years of nervous hands. A scholar once described this kind of justice as discipline externalized. The idea that authority survives only when visible, audible, and tangible. The whip wasn't just an instrument of pain, but of continuity, a sound that told the world its laws still held. You step inside the tavern, the air thick with smoke and the sharp sweetness of cider, and you hear sailors swapping stories of punishments as if they were weather reports, who took 12 lashes and laughed, who fainted at 5, who earned a pardon after 10 because the boatswain pitied him. Pain becomes folklore, retold until it loses its edge. Someone mentions an old superstition that being flogged at sea grants it immunity from drowning. No one knows if it's true, but everyone knocks wood just in case. The laughter that follows is tired but genuine, the kind born from shared absurdity. You sit by the window and watch the moonlight ripple over the masts, thinking how strange it is that humanity found meaning in repetition. Flogging on land, flogging at sea. It's the same choreography performed on different stages. The whip rises, the audience gasps, the condemned bows, the act ends, and everyone feels reassured that order still stands. The next morning they'll wake, mend sails, grind flour, march to church, and tell their children that fairness means knowing where the pain goes. The line between justice and ritual blurs until it vanishes entirely. You imagine the ocean itself remembering every lash, every scream, carrying those sounds in its depths like an archive of obedience. Somewhere beneath those waves lie splinters of decks and rusted shackles, relics of a time when discipline was considered a form of salvation. The sea swells gently now, indifferent, but if you listen closely, you might still hear that faint rhythm. The whips rise and fall, blending with the crash of surf, punishment disguised as nature's heartbeat. As the night grows colder, you think of the scholars who still argue about this age. Some romanticize its simplicity, others condemn its cruelty, yet both miss the quiet truth that survives between extremes. The Middle Ages didn't invent punishment, they perfected its performance. They turned morality into spectacle, fear into governance, endurance into virtue. And you, standing here centuries later in imagination, can still feel the residue of that logic in every system that mistakes obedience for order. The moon drifts higher, silvering the ropes, and the ship's bell tolls softly for midnight. The harbor sleeps, but the echo of the day lingers, a faint salt taste in the air, the whisper of rope fibers stretched to memory. You close your eyes and breathe it in, letting the rhythm slow, and as the last sound fades, you realize that beneath the whip's cruelty was always the same fragile hope, that pain once seen might keep chaos away a little longer. Whether on sea or land, that was the promise and the lie that kept the world turning. You walk into a narrow courtyard behind the town hall, where the smell of iron and smoke hangs thick in the air, and you instantly know this place has seen too many lessons carved into flesh. A wooden block stands at the center, stained dark with old history, and beside it rests a small table holding the tools of humiliation, sharp knives, cloth rags, and a bucket of brine that steams faintly in the morning chill. The crowd gathers slowly, quieter than usual now, because what's about to happen isn't meant to entertain. This punishment is different, final, visible, and permanent. The condemned man is led out by 2 guards, a thin rope around his wrists, his expression hollow but proud, as if dignity were the last thing they couldn't cut away. He's been found guilty of forgery, an offense that, in a world ruled by seals and signatures, counted as treason against truth itself. The constable reads his sentence in a voice too formal for the brutality that follows. 1 ear removed, and a mark across the nose, so all who see him will know deceit lives beneath his skin. The air stills as the executioner steps forward, not the hooded figure of legend, but a weary craftsman in a leather apron. His knife catches the light, a glint like winter sun on water, and the sound that follows, a quick slice, a muffled gasp echoes far too cleanly through the stone yard. The man sways but doesn't cry out. The severed ear falls into the brine with a hiss, and someone in the crowd crosses themselves as though to ward off the memory. The second part is worse. not for the pain but for what it means. The knife draws a line down the bridge of the nose, shallow but permanent, a signature written by the law itself. Blood trickles, slow and dark, into the dust. You feel your stomach tighten, not from horror exactly, but from the eerie calm of everyone watching. It's not cruelty that frightens you. It's how ordinary it looks, as if this were simply maintenance work on morality. A mainstream historical fact whispers here. In the 13th and 14th centuries, ear cropping and nose slitting were official punishments across much of Europe, sanctioned for crimes like perjury, adultery, and counterfeiting. In England, statutes under Henry I and later Henry VIII detailed exactly how deep the cut should go, as though precision could make barbarity civilized. In some towns, the cropped ear was even nailed to a post afterward, a warning and a grotesque proof of law fulfilled. The man now kneels as the surgeon wraps linen around his head, the fabric already blooming red in spots. No one cheers, no one claps. The punishment's power lies in silence. You realize that while the stocks or pillory invited laughter, mutilation demanded awe. It transformed a human being into a living document, proof of both crime and consequence. A fringe tidbit from an obscure German chronicle tells of a tailor who, after losing both ears for theft, stitched small pieces of leather where they had been, decorating them with brass rings so convincingly that travelers paid him for luck charms, believing his ears had turned to relics. People always find strange ways to survive shame. Even mutilation becomes a kind of reinvention. The constable doesn't like that story, though. He believes marks must remain marks, not badges of defiance. You look around at the villagers, faces solemn but curious, and you understand that everyone here is learning something, not mercy, not morality, but the price of disobedience written in visible scars. Scholars still debate whether such punishments were truly deterrents or if they served a more theatrical purpose. Some claim that in small medieval communities where everyone knew everyone else, bodily mutilation was the most efficient form of criminal record, an instant lifelong warning label. Others argue that the public nature of these acts was part of collective catharsis, a social ritual that reassured people the moral order hadn't slipped beyond repair. Watching the man rise now, you think both are true. The townsfolk will sleep easier tonight, not because they're safer, but because they've seen the system breathe. The surgeon finishes binding the man's wounds, and the constable dismisses the crowd. The condemned is handed a rag to press against his face. His steps are slow but steady as he leaves through the back gate. You catch one last glimpse of him, bandages glowing white against the dusk, and it strikes you that in a world obsessed with purity, scars were often mistaken for proof of cleansing. The courtyard empties. The bucket of brine is poured onto the ground, its mixture of salt and blood seeping into the cracks between stones. The executioner wipes his blade clean, sets it aside, and lights a pipe as though this were simply another trade well performed. The smell of smoke merges with the faint iron tang in the air, and you stand still, feeling the quiet hum of history in your bones. It's strange, you think, how visible punishment fades from view even when it never disappears. The next morning, people will return to their stalls, to gossip and bread-making and prayer, and the man with the bandaged face will walk among them, a reminder disguised as a neighbor. Children will stare, mothers will whisper, and before long his absence of an ear will become as ordinary as the town bell. That's the cruel genius of medieval justice. It taught people to live beside horror until it felt like order. You take one last breath before leaving, the air thick with the metallic ghost of pain, and as the sun dips behind the rooftops, the shadows stretch long and thin like memory trying to forget what it can't erase. The next morning begins with a thin fog clinging to the rooftops, curling over the chimneys like the smoke of yesterday's guilt, and as you walk through the crooked alleys toward the marketplace, you catch the faint smell of pitch before you even see the crowd. The smell is unmistakable. sharp, oily, heavy with the promise of spectacle, and you follow it to the town gate, where a group of men are stirring something thick and black in an iron cauldron over a roaring fire. The mixture bubbles like anger itself, tar melting into a viscous sheen that hisses each time the flames lick its edges. A wooden cart rattles into view, and in it sits a man bound at the wrists, his tunic torn, his face ghost-pale beneath the grime. The townsfolk press closer, their breath visible in the cold air, the murmur of anticipation spreading through them like a tide. Today's punishment is not about blood or silence, it's about spectacle. The condemned has been caught stealing taxes, an unforgivable crime in a world where every coin feels like it belongs to God. You can feel the energy of the crowd shift from curiosity to excitement as the constable raises his hand for quiet and reads the decree. There are no gallows here, no scaffold, only the bubbling tar that glows like liquid midnight. The crowd is hungry for a show, and this one promises to leave a mark no washing can remove. Two men step forward, carrying the prisoner toward the cauldron. The smell intensifies until it clings to your throat, thick and sweet, impossible to swallow. The executioner dips a ladle into the tar, lifting it carefully, and as it drips back down in slow black threads you understand why this punishment endured. It was both cruel and mesmerizing. When the first splash of hot pitch hits the man's shoulders, he stiffens, the sound that escapes his mouth halfway between a gasp and a prayer. The crowd murmurs, some stepping back, others craning forward to see the dark sheen spread across his skin like armor forged from pain. A bag of feathers is brought forward, goose feathers, light and pale, fluttering like mockery, and with careful precision the executioner tosses them into the air. They stick instantly, clinging to the tar, transforming the man into a grotesque parody of a bird. A cheer rises, uneven but eager, and someone shouts that he's ready to fly. You don't laugh, you can't. The absurdity is too sharp, too human, too deliberate. A mainstream historical fact drifts through your mind like smoke. Tarring and feathering emerged in England by the late 12th century and became a form of vigilante justice across Europe and, later, colonial America. It was never an official sentence of the crown, but rather a communal act, a performance of anger disguised as morality. It required no judge, no jury, only a crowd that believed humiliation was healing. The feathers flutter in the air like snowflakes, while the tar cools to a dull gloss, and the man, trembling, is lifted back onto the cart. The guards tie him upright so that all can see their handiwork as he is paraded through the streets. Children run alongside, laughing, calling him the black goose of greed, their voices carrying down the lanes like a cruel rhyme that will live longer than the memory of the man himself. A fringe tidbit from a Norman record tells of one unusual case where a tarring went wrong. The pitch overheated, catching fire, and the crowd, unwilling to lose their entertainment, poured ale over the victim to douse the flames before cheering even louder when he survived. They called it the devil's baptism, a phrase that stuck for generations. You imagine that smell, burnt tar, scorched feathers, ale foam, and realize it's the scent of human hypocrisy dressed up as moral order. Some scholars still debate whether tarring and feathering was punishment or protest, arguing that it often targeted corrupt officials rather than common criminals. Was it justice from below or mob cruelty pretending to be virtue? The lines blur in the heat of that cauldron. You suspect it didn't matter. Once the tar touched skin, righteousness and rage were indistinguishable. The cart rattles forward, wheels crunching over gravel, feathers drifting off into the morning breeze. You follow behind, hearing the rhythm of the man's labored breathing. The crowd's laughter grows thinner as the novelty wears off, replaced by unease. It's one thing to shout judgment from a distance, it's another to walk beside it. The tar stiffens as it cools, turning his skin into a cage that cracks when he moves. Each step must feel like breaking glass. You glance at his face half hidden by clumped feathers, and for a fleeting moment his eyes meet yours. There's no anger there, only disbelief, as though he's watching the world forget itself in real time. The parade continues until the constable finally halts them at the edge of the river. Here, the sentence ends. The man is untied and told to wade into the water to wash away his sins. He steps in slowly, the cold biting through the residue of heat, the tar stiff against the current. It doesn't come off easily. Nothing ever does. When he finally emerges, shivering and featherless, the crowd is already dispersing. Their justice complete, they head back toward the warmth of taverns and hearths, their laughter fading into everyday chatter. The executioner tips the cauldron, spilling the remaining tar into the riverbank where it spreads like ink over mud. The smell lingers long after everyone has gone. You stay behind, watching the black ripples drift downstream, catching bits of sunlight that make them shimmer strangely beautiful. There's something haunting about the reflection. The dark water mirroring a world that believes it's clean because it knows how to disguise its stains. You think about how punishment in the Middle Ages always wanted to be poetic, pain turned to metaphor, shame dressed as redemption. Tarring and feathering perfected that art. It left the body intact but the soul permanently marked, the kind of punishment that travels farther in stories than in scars. The man disappears down the road, a dark figure against the morning haze, and you wonder what happens next for him. Will he find another town where no one knows his name, or will his scent betray him, the faint tang of pitch that even rivers can't erase? You imagine him years from now, telling children he was once a bird who tried to fly too close to God's fire. Maybe they'll laugh. Maybe they'll believe him. The line between legend and survival is thin in times like these. The wind shifts, carrying the last threads of smoke toward the horizon, and you take one last breath before turning away. The tar still bubbles faintly in the cauldron's base, like the world reminding itself that cruelty, when properly packaged, always finds an audience. You leave the riverside behind and wander toward the marshy edge of the village, where the air smells faintly of algae and wood rot, and the fog hugs the ground like an afterthought of justice. There, half hidden beside the watermill, you see another wooden contraption jutting from a platform above the pond, a long beam with a rope and a chair attached, the kind of invention that could only come from a society that found joy in engineering humiliation. It's called the cucking stool, cousin to the ducking stool, but somehow crueler in its indifference. At first glance it almost looks like a swing, but the seat is bound with iron hoops, and the rope creaks under the morning wind like an old laugh that never ends. A small crowd gathers, murmuring, waiting for the next trial, and you realize these people don't see punishment as punishment, they see it as proof that the world still makes sense. The accused today is a baker's wife, charged with selling short-weight loaves and gossiping about the alderman's daughter. She's middle-aged, sharp-eyed, wrapped in a damp shawl, and you can tell from her stillness that she's already resigned to the ritual. The constable reads the charges, voice steady as though listing ingredients for morality: deceit, insolence, disturbance of peace. The crowd listens, heads nodding in rhythm, and two men lift her gently but firmly onto the stool, fastening the iron rings around her waist and wrists. The rope tightens, the beam groans. Someone makes a joke about measuring twice next time, and polite laughter ripples across the water. The constable raises a hand, signaling the start, and the chair dips slowly forward. The surface of the pond trembles, then breaks, swallowing her with a splash that silences everyone for a heartbeat. The sound of bubbles and creaking rope fills the space where empathy should be. A mainstream historical fact whispers itself into the damp air. Cucking stools and similar ordeals were common across medieval Europe from the 13th to 16th centuries, used not only for petty crimes but also for moral offenses: gossip, infidelity, blasphemy, and witchcraft. The logic behind them was alarmingly straightforward. If a person sank, they were innocent but probably dead. If they floated, guilt proved itself. justice by buoyancy. You can't help but think how much faith it takes to replace evidence with physics, and how little mercy hides behind that kind of confidence. The woman reemerges gasping, hair plastered to her face, coughing out pond water and pride. The constable waits exactly long enough for her to breathe before signaling again, and she goes under once more, her skirt billowing beneath the surface like a drowning flag. The crowd doesn't jeer this time. They watch in reverent silence as if witnessing divine arithmetic unfold. A fringe tidbit from a Welsh parish record adds an odd twist. Some villages decorated their cucking stools with carved saints, believing the holy faces would lend truth to the test. Others tied bits of lavender to the beam to ward off evil spirits. The superstition mixed so thoroughly with cruelty that people began to see both as one and the same thing. When the woman is finally lifted out a third time, shivering and pale, the crowd seems unsure what to do. The constable, clearly improvising, declares that her survival proves God's patience and commands that she confess her sins publicly. She doesn't. She simply looks at them, silent, eyes wide and steady, and somehow that defiance feels louder than any apology could. You realize, then, that the real test isn't whether she floats, it's whether she breaks. Scholars still debate the psychology of these ordeals. Some call them ritualized chaos, arguing they allowed medieval communities to vent collective fear under the guise of faith. Others describe them as a primitive kind of trial by public conscience, a theater where guilt and innocence mattered less than the relief of watching someone else suffer instead of you. Standing there, it feels less like justice and more like exorcism, the crowd's guilt drowning in someone else's body. You can hear them breathe easier each time she resurfaces. By the time it's over, the constable declares the sentence fulfilled and orders her released. The men unfasten the iron hoops and she stumbles to her feet, soaked to the bone but still upright. The crowd disperses slowly. Conversations already shifting toward supper, their curiosity spent. The rope swings lazily in the breeze, dripping a slow rhythm into the pond, each droplet marking the seconds it takes for cruelty to become routine. You watch her walk away, her shawl clinging to her shoulders like seaweed, and you wonder if she'll ever speak again. Maybe she'll bake bread tomorrow and sell it at the same stall, pretending nothing happened. Maybe she'll move to another village, one that hasn't yet invented its own way to measure truth with a chair and a rope. The water settles back into stillness, reflecting the gray sky as if erasing the memory on purpose. The villagers will call this a fair outcome. No death, no blood, only order restored. But as you stand there, listening to the faint creak of the empty stool, it feels like something much heavier has drowned beneath that surface. The cucking stool gleams wet in the mist, a relic of belief masquerading as reason, and the air tastes faintly of iron and lilies. You turn away, heart slower now, thinking how in every age people invent new ways to test what they fear most, and how often those tests end up proving nothing except the depth of their cruelty. The path from the pond winds upward toward a barren hill where the wind never rests, and from a distance you can already see the strange silhouette waiting against the horizon. A great wooden wheel mounted on a pole, its spokes reaching out like the ribs of some long-dead giant. The villagers call it simply the wheel, but the chroniclers gave it grander names: the breaking wheel, Catherine wheel, the wheel of pain. As you draw closer, you notice how the grass around it never seems to grow right, how the earth stays bare and trodden, and you understand that this is not a place of death but of endurance. The crowd gathers here less often now, only when the crime is so grave that it demands the theater of the hill. Today the condemned is a robber who murdered a merchant on the road to York, a crime that drew fear into every traveler's step. He stands before the wheel, gaunt and barefoot, wrists tied behind his back, eyes distant as though he's already halfway gone. The executioner, a burly man with a heavy hammer, adjusts the ropes, humming softly under his breath. The sky hangs low and gray, the wind carrying the smell of distant rain and wet metal. You feel the air thicken with that familiar medieval mixture of awe and moral excitement. This punishment isn't meant merely to end life. It's designed to sculpt a warning visible from miles away. The condemned is laid upon the wheel, his body bound across its spokes, limbs spread awkwardly, head tilted toward the heavens that will not answer. The executioner raises his hammer, and the sound that follows is dull, deliberate, final. The bones yield with a crack that seems to echo through the valley. It is horror by geometry, the body forced to fit the circle that represents eternity, a perverse symmetry between justice and suffering. A mainstream historical fact reminds you that the breaking wheel was used throughout medieval Europe, codified under the Holy Roman Empire and later France, often reserved for the gravest crimes, murder, treason, and sacrilege. Sometimes the victim was executed first and displayed afterward. Sometimes, as here, the sentence included the slow destruction of the body itself. Medieval law books even listed the order of bones to be broken, as if mercy could be measured in sequence. The hammer falls again. You find yourself counting without meaning to, each impact another step away from compassion. A fringe tidbit buried in a German chronicle describes how, in one rare case, an executioner accidentally broke the wheel instead of the man, splintering the wood so completely that the crowd took it as a divine sign and demanded the prisoner's release. He was pardoned and became a monk, his story retold for centuries as proof that even tools of cruelty could falter before faith. You look at the wheel before you now, sturdy and unyielding, and wonder if this one will ever break. The executioner pauses, wiping sweat from his brow, and then begins the next act, weaving the mangled body between the spokes, binding each limb with rope so that the corpse itself becomes part of the structure. This, too, is part of the ritual. The wheel will remain on display for days, perhaps weeks, until time or birds undo the knots. The crowd murmurs prayers and gossip in equal measure. The priest lifts his cross, offering absolution to whoever's still listening. The condemned groans once low, almost grateful, and then stills. The wind catches the wheel, turning it slowly, making the whole grotesque creation creak and moan as if alive. Scholars still debate the symbolic meaning of the breaking wheel. Some interpret it as a cosmic metaphor, the circle of sin and punishment, eternity mirrored in human form. Others insist it was pure pragmatism, a public scaffold that maximized visibility and deterrence in an era with few written laws. Yet watching it now, spinning slowly against the gray sky, you sense something older, almost pagan, a remnant of sacrifice disguised as justice. The villagers don't see cruelty here. They see balance restored, order reasserted, the world realigned by a geometry of pain. The children who watch will grow up believing that morality has a shape, and that to break a rule is to be folded back into that circle until nothing remains straight. The rain begins just as the crowd starts to leave. Soft at first, then harder, washing the dust and the blood together into the soil. The wheel turns once more in the wind, creaking like an old church door, and for a moment you imagine it spinning forever, carrying the weight of every punishment that ever claimed to be righteous. The hill empties, but the sound lingers, a low groan, a rhythm of wood and memory, and you know that even when no one is watching, the wheel keeps moving, as if justice itself is afraid to stop. You descend from the hill as dusk bleeds into night, following the lantern glow toward a fortress at the edge of town, its towers grim and watchful above the moor. The air grows colder here, quieter too, and every sound, the creak of your boots, the hum of the wind, feels like it might be overheard by the stones themselves. Inside, the corridors are narrow and damp, torches sputtering in brackets along the wall, and you realize that this is not a prison of noise but of waiting. A guard leads you to a small chamber at the end of the hall, and there it sits, the iron chair. At first it looks almost ordinary, like something a blacksmith might use for rest between work, until you see the glint of hundreds of metal spikes covering every surface: the seat, the back, the arms, even the footrest. It's not a chair, it's a threat disguised as furniture. The torchlight flickers over it, making the spikes glimmer like frost, and you can't help but feel that it's staring back, eager to remember another body. The condemned today is a merchant accused of treason, or perhaps simply of being too successful for the wrong noble's liking. His eyes dart around the room, searching for mercy in faces that have none. The inquisitor stands nearby, robe heavy with authority, voice smooth as oil, as he explains the procedure, not to the accused but to the record keeper writing on parchment at the table. The purpose, he says, is clarification of truth through discomfort. You can't help noticing how cleanly that phrase replaces the word pain. 2 guards lift the man and lower him slowly onto the iron chair. He shudders the moment metal touches fabric, and when they tie the straps across his wrists and ankles, the spikes dig in just enough to draw thin lines of red through his clothes. The inquisitor asks his first question in a tone that might belong to a priest reciting morning prayers. The merchant denies everything. A nod from the inquisitor, and the guards begin to turn the iron screws that tighten the chair's joints, pressing the spikes deeper. The man gasps. You feel your throat tighten with his breath. The air smells of iron, sweat, and old oil. A mainstream historical fact burns quietly at the back of your mind. Iron chairs existed across late medieval Europe, particularly in Germany and northern Italy, often used by inquisitors or local magistrates for interrogation. They weren't meant to kill quickly but to terrify, designed so that the heat from nearby coals could warm the metal until each spike became its own tiny ember. They called it questioning with warmth. Some versions even had holes beneath the seat so that small fires could be lit directly beneath. The design was both genius and madness, precise enough for control, cruel enough for confession. The inquisitor asks again. The merchant shakes his head, trembling. Another nod, another turn of the screws. The spikes press through the fabric now. A few pierce skin. Blood beads along the edges like condensation. The man begins to speak, half-truths tumbling out, anything to fill the silence. The inquisitor writes it down as calmly as if dictating a letter. A fringe tidbit recorded by an Italian chronicler tells of one particular iron chair fitted with musical pipes that whistled softly when the victim shifted, the air pushed through by movement and pain. They called it the singing chair, as though art and agony should always share a stage. The chronicler claimed it comforted the inquisitors, the melody reminding them that even suffering could sound divine. You stare at the spikes glinting under torchlight and wonder whether invention and cruelty have ever truly been strangers. Scholars still debate the psychological purpose of devices like this. Some insist they were symbolic, a demonstration of absolute control meant to frighten more than harm. Others argue they were practical tools, calibrated instruments for extracting truth when words alone seemed too unreliable. But as you stand there, the distinction feels meaningless. Whether the chair was heated or cold, confession or silence, the result was the same, a body molded to fit a story someone else wanted told. The inquisitor finally signals for release. The screws unwind, the iron creaks. The man slumps forward, breathing raggedly but alive. The guards lift him gently, almost tenderly, onto a wooden bench nearby. The inquisitor signs a document, folds it neatly, and tells the clerk to record that the truth has been clarified. The torches flicker lower now, their light thin and tired. You notice that no one meets the prisoner's eyes. The iron chair sits quietly again, cooling in the dim light, drops of blood drying in the tiny hollows between its spikes. It looks almost peaceful, like a monster that's eaten and now waits to sleep. When you finally step outside, the night air feels too light, almost unreal. The fortress looms behind you, its windows glowing faintly like watchful eyes. You think of all the people who must have passed through that chamber, each leaving behind a thread of story, a breath caught between truth and endurance. The iron chair wasn't built to kill. It was built to persuade, to remind people that power doesn't need speed when it has patience. You walk down the path, the sound of your footsteps mixing with the faint ringing in your ears, and realize that even centuries later, the chair still works. It makes you want to sit very still, to tell the world anything it asks, just to stop hearing the metal breathe. You step away from the fortress and into the rain-slick alleys where puddles reflect the moon like fragments of old truth, following the smell of smoke and wet iron until it leads you to a smaller chamber tucked beneath the blacksmith's yard. Inside, the air is heavy with heat and fear, a claustrophobic blend of sweat and candle wax that clings to your lungs as you breathe. Here there are no grand scaffolds or wheels of spectacle, only a bench, a table of tools, and the quiet efficiency of men who call themselves servants of justice. At the center of the room stands a pair of objects that seem almost innocent in their simplicity, a long wooden device shaped like a boot, hinged at one side, and beside it, a small metal screw fitted with two flat plates. They look like workshop tools, until you notice the faint stains darkened into the grain of the wood, the grooves worn smooth by trembling hands. These are the boot and the thumb screw, the twin children of logic and cruelty, devices designed not for execution but for revelation, or at least for the version of revelation the Inquisitor wanted to hear. The condemned tonight is a scribe accused of heresy, a man who wrote too much truth in too beautiful a way. His ankles are bound, his ink-stained fingers trembling as he glances toward the tools on the table. The Inquisitor, the same one who oversaw the iron chair yesterday, greets him politely, like a host inviting a guest to supper. There is always this strange civility about the process, as if manners could balance out torment. The guards fit his leg into the wooden shell of the boot and begin tightening the wedges with careful taps of a mallet. Each strike drives the wood closer, compressing bone and flesh until sound itself seems to pulse through the walls. The man's breath turns ragged, but he doesn't cry out. He knows from whispered rumor that silence is its own resistance. The Inquisitor asks again for names, alliances, forbidden books. The man answers with nonsense at first, sentences half made of prayer and half of delirium. The mallet taps again, a soft crack, followed by a noise that isn't quite a scream. It's the sound of disbelief leaving the body. A mainstream historical fact hovers in your thoughts like a candle guttering in the dark. Both the boot and the thumbscrew were documented throughout Europe by the late medieval period, especially during inquisitorial trials and witch hunts. The boot came in variations, sometimes wood, sometimes iron, sometimes wrapped with cords that tightened like snakes when twisted. The purpose was never to kill quickly but to break will through endurance. The thumbscrew was smaller, portable, almost elegant, two metal plates drawn together by a turning screw, crushing fingers, thumbs, or sometimes toes until nerves surrendered before truth did. Records from Scotland, Spain, and the Holy Roman Empire all described them with the same detached precision used for farming tools or musical instruments. Pain was a craft, and medieval inquisitors were its guildsmen. A fringe tidbit from a Flemish manuscript mentions that some inquisitors brought their own thumbscrews to trials like a painter carrying favorite brushes, claiming that the familiar weight in hand brought accuracy of persuasion. You imagine a man polishing his screw before confession, proud of his workmanship. The thought makes the room colder. The Inquisitor now nods toward the smaller tool, and a guard steps forward, taking the scribe's right hand, placing his thumb between the plates. The first turn is gentle, almost polite. The second groans. By the third, the sound has changed. It's no longer a human noise but something deeper, something primal, as though the world itself flinches at the act. Blood wells along the cuticles, dark against pale skin. The Inquisitor leans closer and whispers something about salvation. The scribe finally speaks, words tumbling out, half confession, half invention, anything to make the turning stop. The clerk writes them down without hesitation. Ink meets parchment like a signature on a contract that no one will read again. Scholars still debate whether these devices were meant purely for confession or if they served as instruments of psychological domination. Some argue that they were intended to extract specific answers, others that they simply proved the reach of authority. One modern historian calls them conversations with pain, a phrase that fits too neatly to dismiss. You look at the boot, at the thumbscrew, at the tools glinting under candlelight, and realize they were never designed to reveal truth, only to create it. In a world where truth belonged to those with power, every scream became evidence, every silence an admission. The inquisitor finally gestures for the guards to stop. The scribe slumps forward, his hand mangled, his foot swollen, yet his eyes, when they open, are strangely calm. Perhaps pain has circled back to quiet. The inquisitor sighs, writes something on a scroll, and declares the matter closed. The guards remove the boot, the leg inside already bruised and blackening, and you notice how gently they handle the man now, as if the ritual itself has exhausted their cruelty. The inquisitor nods to the clerk, who extinguishes one candle, signaling that the night's business is done. The scribe is carried out, half conscious, leaving faint drops of blood on the flagstones. The boot and thumbscrew remain on the table, cooling in the heavy air. They look almost peaceful, like sleeping tools between tasks. The inquisitor removes his gloves, murmurs a short prayer to no one in particular, and leaves the room. You stand alone now, listening to the soft tick of cooling metal and distant rain on the roof, and it strikes you how quiet the world becomes once confession is complete. Outside, the air smells of wet earth and ash. You walk through the narrow lane, the sky a low ceiling of cloud, and you think about how instruments of pain always begin as solutions, ways to fix disorder, to restore faith, to prove control. The boot was born from fear of deceit, the thumbscrew from fear of silence. They turned pain into punctuation marks, moments where meaning could be forced into existence. As you move farther from the chamber, the night opens around you, and you realize the true genius of medieval punishment wasn't its violence, it was its logic. Every wound could be justified, every tool sanctified, as long as someone wrote it down neatly in the Book of Order. You breathe in the cool air, letting it wash the iron taste from your lungs, and as you walk toward the faint lights of the next village, the sound of rain against the cobblestones becomes rhythmic, almost soothing, like the slow unwinding of the screws themselves. You leave the alley behind and wander toward the shadowed warehouses near the edge of town, where the air smells of damp wood, mold, and something sharper, something that makes your nose wrinkle involuntarily. Here, the punishment you encounter is a testament to medieval creativity and cruelty, a combination of fear, endurance, and public spectacle. At the center of the yard sits a large wooden barrel, upright, open at the top, with ropes coiled neatly beside it. Inside, scuttling shadows move too quickly to follow, and the faint, unsettling sound of tiny claws scratching against wood fills the air. This is the rat barrel, a device designed not only to frighten, but to force a criminal into direct confrontation with creatures the community despised. Rats, ubiquitous and clever, survivors like the people they haunted. The condemned is a man accused of petty theft, coins lifted from the market stalls, but here the severity is magnified. Survival alone will determine the lesson. The guards tie his hands behind his back and guide him toward the barrel. The first glimpse inside reveals the glittering eyes of dozens of rats, whiskers twitching and teeth bared in silent anticipation. The man swallows hard. The crowd forms a wide circle, murmuring in low tones, aware that even a misstep can provoke chaos. A mainstream historical fact enters your mind as the man hesitates. Accounts from German and English town records in the late medieval period describe similar punishments for thieves, fraudsters, and vagrants. These punishments were designed to exploit innate fears, rats, darkness, and confinement to create a psychological as well as physical ordeal. The barrels were often lined with straw or old cloth to prevent accidental death, though injuries and infections were common, and the ordeal was recorded in local chronicles as both entertainment and moral lesson. The man is lowered into the barrel slowly, the rats surging around his feet and calves, nipping at cloth and skin. He flinches, jerking instinctively, and a small ripple of laughter escapes from the edges of the crowd. You realize quickly that the punishment is not simply about the rats themselves, but the vulnerability it exposes, the helplessness it magnifies. The rats are cunning. Some burrow beneath folds in clothing, others climb toward exposed wrists, and the man writhes, attempting to maintain balance while avoiding bites, their tiny claws raking over his skin with sharp precision. A fringe tidbit suggests that in some villages, the rats were trained to bite more aggressively, or at least encouraged by the placement of scraps of meat, turning the punishment into a perverse game of survival. Chronicles from 15th century Flanders describe a man who reportedly spent hours in the barrel, emerging only when the overseer deemed he had learned enough humility, and his account became local legend for both its horror and his stubborn endurance. Scholars still debate whether this punishment was primarily about deterrence or public spectacle. One argument is that the visibility and fear factor made it effective in a world with few written laws, ensuring compliance by social pressure. Another interpretation sees it as symbolic, a ritual confrontation with the dangers of vice, in which the rats represented the consequences of sin, gnawing at the individual until confession or submission occurred. Either way, the man's body moves frantically, muscles taut, skin pale, and every inhale carries the metallic scent of sweat mixed with the musk of rodents. The executioner steps back, observing with meticulous care as the crowd murmurs its judgment. Children peek from behind skirts, the older men shift uneasily, and women clutch one another, whispering prayers for the man's endurance. The ordeal continues for what seems like hours, though in truth only minutes pass, and each movement of the rats, each squeak, each scratch is magnified by the tension in the yard. The man begins to sweat so profusely that the rats lose interest momentarily, slipping past dampened hair and clothing to climb elsewhere. The sensory assault, the smell, the cold, the slick wood underfoot, the tiny teeth creates a relentless psychological pressure that has nothing to do with pain inflicted by humans, and everything to do with fear exploited with precision. Finally, the overseer signals the guards to pull the man out. His body is trembling, clothes torn, skin marked by scratches, and the rats scatter into the corners of the yard, indifferent to his suffering. The crowd exhales collectively, some in relief, some in quiet awe at his endurance. The man slumps on the ground, hands trembling, eyes wide as the executioner sprays a bucket of water over the barrel to calm the remaining rats. The rat barrel was more than punishment. It was pedagogy through terror. In a society where morality was inseparable from public perception, the visibility of vulnerability served as lesson and entertainment in equal measure. You watch the man stagger to a bench, rubbing his wrists and arms, and you realize that the true weight of the punishment wasn't carried on his back or feet, but on his mind, the knowledge that at any moment a rat could bite, scratch, or frighten, a constant, unpredictable danger. The crowd disperses slowly, muttering about diligence, honesty, and divine justice, leaving the yard eerily quiet, the rats retreating into hidden cracks and shadows. You step back and breathe in the damp air, tinged with fear and something darker, understanding that in this world, survival often depended not on skill, strength, or cunning, but on endurance through humiliation and the patience of cruelty. And as the moonlight glints across the barrel, now empty and still, you feel the haunting truth of medieval justice. It was designed to leave a mark far beyond flesh, etched deeply into memory and story. You leave the marshy yard behind, walking down a narrow lane where the evening fog clings to the cobblestones, carrying the faint smell of burned wood and wet clay, and you realize that some punishments require silence more than spectacle. Ahead, in a small square between timbered houses, stands a collection of devices you've only heard whispered about in chronicles: the brank, the iron cage, and the gag. Each one is designed to impose quiet, each one to make the body confess to words the town wishes it hadn't heard. The brank, a metal cage fitted over the head with a sharpened gag pressing on the tongue, glints dully in the fading light, spikes and clasps catching what little sun remains. Next to it is a small cage roughly constructed, meant to confine the offender so completely that movement itself becomes punishment. And the gag, a simple but cruel mouthpiece, lies on a wooden table, polished by years of use. A woman is led forward, accused of scandalous speech and disorderly conduct, a charge as flexible as the temper of the town council. She moves carefully, her hands bound, eyes wary, the crowd forming a wide semicircle around her as if witnessing a small ritual of inevitability. A mainstream historical fact informs your mind as you watch. Branks and gags were widely used across England and Scotland in the 16th and 17th centuries, often targeting women accused of scolding, gossiping, or mocking authority. The brank was particularly feared because it was public, humiliating, and painfully literal in silencing speech. Town records from Oxfordshire even describe instances where multiple women were fitted with branks simultaneously, paraded through the marketplace to demonstrate civic authority and moral discipline. You observe the woman's lips pressed in a line of defiance as the metal cage is fitted over her head, the gag pressing against her tongue, and you notice how every movement is constrained, every glance measured by iron. The executioner adjusts the straps with mechanical precision, tightening until the slightest attempt to speak results in sharp, painful pressure, and you feel the tension in the air, as if the silence itself is audible. A fringe detail from a 17th century Dutch manuscript notes that in some villages, the brank was modified with bells, so that even the slightest twitch of the tongue rang out, amplifying shame with sound. In other accounts, townsmen would decorate the cage with ribbons or paint to mark festivals, turning punishment into a grotesque spectacle of civic pride. Scholars continue to debate the purpose. Some argue it was purely about moral control, others that it functioned as social theater, reinforcing norms through spectacle rather than severity. Watching now, you realize both are true. The woman's head is locked in place, her eyes scanning the crowd, the spikes glinting as light fades. Every twitch sends pain through her jaw, every attempt at speech a lesson in obedience. The iron cage nearby waits silently for its turn, a waiting room of punishment designed to leave the body and mind in suspension. Another offender, a young man accused of insulting a magistrate, is lowered into it. He sits tightly within the bars, barely able to move, forced to remain upright for hours while the crowd discusses his crime in whispers and murmurs. The combination of confinement, public scrutiny, and the ever-present gaze of authority presses down with a weight heavier than chains. The air smells faintly of rust, sweat, and fear, mingling in a perfume that is uniquely medieval. You notice how quickly onlookers grow accustomed to the scene. The shock fades into normalcy, the extraordinary becoming routine. As the woman endures the brank, the young man shifts slightly in the cage, groaning softly under the pressure of iron against skin. The crowd murmurs advice, some sympathetic, some sharp-tongued, but no one intervenes. The lesson is clear. Society enforces silence through fear, humiliation, and physical constraint, and those who resist endure alone. Scholars debate whether these devices were effective deterrents, or if they merely reinforced the spectacle of authority. Some claim that the lasting impression was psychological rather than physical, imprinting obedience through shame and fear rather than through lasting harm. You watch the woman's hands tremble at her sides, The young man's head droops slightly, and you feel the weight of the centuries in that square. Every iron clasp, every sharp edge, every carefully applied strap is a reminder that in medieval society, control was as much about appearance and perception as it was about law. The sun finally sets, casting a purple hue across the square. Shadows stretch long and thin over the stones, exaggerating the height of the cages and the spikes of the brink. The townsfolk begin to drift away, leaving the punishment devices behind, quiet and gleaming, waiting for the next offender, the next lesson. You linger a moment longer, breathing in the cool air, letting the faint metallic scent fill your lungs. Even in their absence, the brank, cage, and gag communicate their lesson. Obedience and silence are inseparable in a world where authority is tangible, where punishment is both performance and pedagogy. The square empties, the devices gleam under the first stars, and you realize that medieval justice is less about the individual being punished and more about reminding the living that silence, endurance, and fear are intertwined, that order is maintained not just by law, but by the memory of pain. You leave the shadowed square behind, walking along narrow streets that smell of wet straw, smoke, and the faint tang of baked bread, and you realize that in the Middle Ages, cruelty was often as inventive as it was inevitable. Ahead, in a clearing beside the old town hall, a stage has been erected, not for music or play, but for a performance of justice where imagination is the chief executioner. Today, the condemned is a young man accused of theft and blasphemy, and the judges, eager to impress the community, have devised a punishment more theatrical than practical. A scaffold stands at the center, decorated with painted symbols of virtue and sin, flags fluttering in the breeze. There are no weapons of steel here, no immediate threat to life. Instead, a series of contraptions, ropes, weights, and timed mechanisms await the offender, designed to confound, frighten, and humiliate simultaneously. The crowd gathers, murmuring in anticipation, children perched on shoulders, the older men muttering about justice, and the women whispering prayers as if someone could thread mercy through the air. The young man's eyes dart nervously from one device to the next, realizing that in this world, imagination is as sharp a tool as any blade. A mainstream historical fact grounds the scene. Medieval European towns often employed theatrical punishments to instill moral lessons, with punishments for fraud, heresy, or petty crimes designed to amuse the public while enforcing social norms. These performances could range from elaborate stocks and pillories to contraptions that simulated danger without causing lasting harm. The artistry lay in the spectacle. Punishment became a form of public theater, reinforcing civic order while engaging the audience emotionally. The young man is strapped to a platform that tilts slowly, forcing him to balance precariously as weighted ropes pull subtly at his limbs, designed to threaten without breaking bones. Mechanisms creak and groan with every adjustment, the sound amplified across the square. Every twist, every squeak, every deliberate wobble is orchestrated to maximize tension. The audience gasps, leans forward, whispers, and occasionally laughs, not at the man's misfortune so much as at the ingenuity of the executioners, the choreography of fear itself. A fringe tidbit from a Flemish chronicle describes a similar execution where the offender was attacked by mechanical birds that flapped suddenly, triggered by a hidden pulley system. The crowd recoiled at the sight, convinced the birds were enchanted, while the man inside shrieked from fright rather than injury. These devices were sometimes invented by blacksmiths or carpenters moonlighting as agents of law, merging craft with cruelty, imagination with enforcement. Scholars debate the extent to which such punishments were intended as deterrents versus spectacles. Some argue that their function was moral education, others that they were opportunities for communal catharsis, for audiences to project their fears onto the body of the punished. In watching this, you feel both truths coexisting. The fear is genuine, the theater deliberate, and the lesson eternal. The first act begins with the platform tilting slightly, forcing the young man to cling to ropes that burn his palms. Each creak of wood echoes through the square like a warning pulse, and the townspeople's attention tightens. The executioners adjust hidden weights that shift unpredictably, forcing the condemned to move constantly, sweat dripping into his eyes, muscles trembling. From above, a pulley drops a small net filled with straw, which hits his back with a satisfying thump, startling him without causing injury. The crowd reacts instantly, gasps rising and fading, a collective inhalation of relief and dread. He staggers forward, balancing precariously, his clothing disheveled, hair sticking to his forehead. The constable reads aloud a moral lesson from the parchment in his hand. Let him learn that dishonesty bends neither wood nor wind but only himself. The words are formal, almost poetic, but they echo strangely in your mind, underlining how much performance matters when justice is public. Another mechanism springs into play. A series of ropes connected to the platform's edges begin to pull intermittently, tilting the young man side to side. He struggles to maintain his balance, feet scraping the wooden planks, heart pounding in rhythm with the creaks and groans of the apparatus. The audience leans forward, silent now, the earlier murmurs replaced by an intensity born of suspense. Even the children stop laughing, eyes wide as they imagine themselves in the offender's place. You notice the way fear has been orchestrated into art, the precision with which each movement, each threat has been calculated to teach a lesson without breaking bones. A fringe note from a German account records a similar setup where hidden bells would ring whenever the prisoner's hands slipped, the sound terrifying enough to amplify anxiety, proving that sound alone can become an instrument of punishment. Scholars continue to debate the philosophical underpinnings of these imaginative punishments. Were they meant to preserve life while instilling moral obedience, or were they a precursor to psychological torment, using ingenuity as leverage over the human mind? The answer seems evident now as you watch the young man teeter, sweat slicking his skin, breath shallow, muscles taut with tension. He is learning obedience, fear, humility, endurance, all lessons bound together in performance. The executioners smile faintly at the subtle adjustments of ropes, the careful timing of threats, ensuring that the punishment is exacting without crossing the line into fatality. The crowd, watching every nuance, absorbs the morality lesson in synchrony, their collective gaze transforming fear into social order. As the sun dips lower, the final act begins. The platform tilts to a near vertical angle, forcing the man to cling to ropes with both hands while the weights pull ever so slightly at his legs. The tension is exquisite, a precise balance between control and chaos, crafted to test both courage and endurance. After several minutes, long enough that each heartbeat feels amplified, the constable nods to the executioners, who release the ropes gradually, allowing the man to collapse to his knees, trembling but alive. The audience exhales, murmurs fading into whispers, their moral lesson absorbed, the performance complete. The young man, disheveled and panting, is guided away, leaving the stage and mechanisms behind, which creak and sway gently in the evening breeze. You step back, breathing in the damp air, realizing that in this medieval world, punishment could be as much about invention as law, and that fear, spectacle, and endurance were instruments wielded with deliberate precision, leaving an imprint on everyone who witnessed it, remembered long after the man himself had disappeared into the folds of the night. You walk along the narrow cobbled streets, past shuttered shops and flickering lanterns, toward the outskirts of the village where the smell of smoke hangs heavier than any bread oven could produce. The air is sharp, tangling with the scent of charred wood, and the faint metallic tang of fear, and you realize that what awaits here is a punishment as old as panic itself. At the center of a cleared square, a pyre stands tall, its timbers stacked meticulously, almost ceremoniously, reaching toward the darkening sky. The condemned, a scholar accused of heresy, is brought forward, robe torn, head held high, carrying the stubborn dignity of someone whose ideas outran the fear of the crowd. The inquisitor reads aloud the charges, voice steady yet commanding, echoing across the silent square. Blasphemy, spreading forbidden texts, corrupting minds. The crowd leans forward, breaths held, a mixture of awe and horror flickering across faces, each person acutely aware that what they are about to witness is as much a lesson in belief as it is a punishment of the flesh. A mainstream historical fact rises in your mind. In medieval Europe, burning at the stake was the prescribed punishment for heresy and certain forms of witchcraft, codified in church law and civic ordinances alike. It was a public affair, designed to terrify and instruct in equal measure, to show the dangers of diverging from accepted doctrine, and to reinforce the authority of both the church and the state. The pyre's flames, when finally ignited, were intended to be both literal and symbolic, consuming the body while serving as a warning to the living that belief could be policed and that ideas could be punished as severely as actions. The condemned's robe catches the faint glow from the torches carried by guards, the light flickering across his pale, determined face. As the fire takes hold, smoke curls upward, a black spiral against the twilight sky, carrying with it the acrid smell of tar and ash, mingling with the distant scent of damp earth and pine. A fringe tidbit from a German chronicle notes that some inquisitors would use green wood or pitch to extend the flames, ensuring that the burning was prolonged enough to instill maximum fear without always intending immediate death, making endurance part of the punishment. Witnesses sometimes described the air above these pyres as charged with an almost electric anticipation, the crackle of fire merging with the collective murmur of the audience, each pop and hiss interpreted as judgment or divine response. Scholars still debate whether executions for heresy were meant primarily as deterrents or as rituals of belief enforcement. One school of thought emphasizes the social and theological necessity, burning as purification of soul and town alike. Another argues that the spectacle was less about doctrinal adherence and more about communal theater, the crowd's fascination with dramatic suffering substituting for reasoned debate. Watching the scholar stand calm amidst ropes and wood, you see both arguments reflected in the scene. The fire is theological, but the awe it inspires is undeniably performative. As the pyre burns brighter, the heat radiates outward, causing the crowd to step back instinctively, the smell of smoke thickening and settling into every corner of the square. The scholar resists flinching, eyes fixed ahead, shoulders squared against the oppressive air. You notice small gestures, the way a breeze shifts smoke away from the ropes, the glint of wet cobblestones under torchlight, details that feel deliberate, as though the universe itself is part of this choreography. The inquisitor observes from a few paces away, quill and parchment in hand, recording the event with meticulous attention to every movement, every flicker of reaction from both condemned and audience. The fire's rhythm becomes almost hypnotic, a pulse measuring the passage of time, marking each breath, each flicker of the scholar's resolve. A quirky detail you might not expect is that townsfolk sometimes collected small embers or ashes afterward, believing that carrying a fragment could protect their homes from heretical influence or bring good luck in baking and farming. These objects were treasured superstitions, a tangible connection to the power the crowd had witnessed and the authority it had reaffirmed. Children stared wide-eyed at these fragments, while adults debated which embers held more protection or were more holy, as if superstition could be quantified and distributed. The scholar, meanwhile, becomes almost abstract in the flames, the physical suffering secondary to the symbolic weight carried by the pyre, a human focal point of communal morality and terror. The pyre's flames crackle, black smoke curling and twisting skyward, carrying faint ash downwind where it mingles with fallen leaves and soil. Scholars of religion and law still debate whether the point of these burnings was more spiritual or more political, whether the ultimate aim was to cleanse the community or to cement authority. You watch the scholar's figure blur in the heat, and for a moment you can almost understand both interpretations simultaneously. The fire communicates obedience, submission, and awe, all in a single consuming motion. As the final embers smolder, the audience disperses slowly, voices hushed, some offering prayers, others whispering conjecture about the scholar's ideas and fate. You step back into the quiet night, inhaling the smoky air, reflecting on how power, fear, and belief have always been intertwined. In this medieval square, the line between instruction and entertainment has long since disappeared, leaving only the memory of a lesson written in fire, body, and collective attention. You leave the smoky square behind, walking along a narrow road lined with darkened cottages and silent gardens, and the air feels heavier here, weighted with anticipation rather than smoke. Ahead, in a small clearing, you see a towering wooden structure, crude yet purposeful, a simple vertical frame with a heavy angled blade suspended above, held by ropes and pulleys. This is the ancestor of the guillotine, an invention centuries ahead of its time, designed to execute swiftly, cleanly, and visibly. The condemned today is a man accused of treason, a noble who dared question the authority of the local lord, and he stands with an air of quiet defiance, head high as if the presence of wood and rope cannot touch the honor he clings to. The executioner checks the ropes, the mechanism, ensuring that the release will be precise. The crowd gathers in a wide semicircle, murmuring in subdued tones a mixture of curiosity, fear, and grim anticipation. Even in this early prototype, the philosophy is clear. Efficiency in death communicates authority as loudly as spectacle ever could. A mainstream historical fact anchors the moment. While the guillotine would not reach France for centuries, similar devices existed in medieval and early modern Europe, often called falling axes, or mechanical heads, and they were employed to execute those who had committed treason, murder, or other capital offenses. The logic behind the device was simple. Swift and visible punishment reinforced law and order, demonstrating the reach of justice while minimizing prolonged suffering, though in practice human error still made these executions gruesome. The condemned is guided onto a small platform, hands bound, feet aligned precisely, neck resting beneath the suspended blade. A rope creaks under tension as the executioner adjusts the mechanism, the air vibrating slightly with the potential energy held in the suspended weight. The crowd is silent, every pair of eyes focused, knowing that a single motion will end the man's life, leaving only the aftermath to speak. A quirky tidbit emerges from a chronicle of a German town. One early falling axe accidentally misfired, severing not only the prisoner's head, but also splitting a log intended for firewood behind him, which the crowd interpreted as divine commentary on the severity of his crimes. People laughed nervously, but the moral message persisted. Mechanical precision can amplify justice, yet randomness still reminds humanity of its fragility. Scholars debate the ancestry and philosophy of such devices. One argument is that these mechanisms reflect an evolving understanding of humane execution, striving for speed, and minimizing suffering. Another perspective sees them as instruments of authority, a technological show of power designed to impress upon the public that law is inescapable, whether wielded by flesh or engineered machine. Watching the man settle beneath the blade, you feel both truths simultaneously, the tension vibrating through your chest, the crowd's anticipation tangible as the rope creaks one final time. The executioner nods to the constable, and with a swift release, the blade falls. The sound is a sharp, hollow crack that seems to echo through the surrounding hills, reverberating in the hearts of the witnesses as much as in the wood. The man's body slumps forward, stillness arriving faster than breath can follow, and the crowd exhales collectively, a single wave of relief and awe. Even in this crude prototype, the lesson is unmistakable. Authority is absolute, efficiency is power, and obedience is non-negotiable. The executioner wipes the blade clean, setting it back into place, ready for the next occasion. The crowd disperses slowly, some whispering prayers, others remarking on the ingenuity of the machine, each internalizing a story of consequence, speed, and inevitability. A fringe observation recorded by a French chronicler notes that some towns considered adding weights or counterbalances to ensure a cleaner cut, turning the execution into a science as well as punishment. The same accounts hint at the fascination spectators had with the mechanics, the rope, the angle, the inevitability of gravity, proving that curiosity and terror have always traveled together. Scholars still debate whether early devices like this were intended more as humane alternatives to manual execution or as dramatic tools of political messaging. You realize as you watch the empty platform now, the blade suspended and glinting under the pale moonlight, that the distinction may not matter. The spectacle itself, precise and relentless, has inscribed the lesson into memory. Compliance is demanded, authority is absolute, and the machinery of justice, whether human or mechanical, leaves an indelible mark on all who witness it. The road back toward the town is quiet, the air heavy with the lingering scent of iron and wood, the memory of movement and inevitability following you like a shadow. You notice how the crowd, once tense, now walks with a steady rhythm of lessons absorbed, their moral understanding codified not in parchment but in observation. The guillotine's ancestor stands ready in the clearing, silent, angular, a combination of logic, craftsmanship, and cruelty, reminding everyone that even the promise of swift execution communicates more effectively than words ever could. The moonlight glints on the blade one last time as you continue down the lane, the sound of distant footsteps mixing with your own heartbeat, leaving the machine to wait for the next moment, the next story, the next lesson in authority, obedience, and the terrifying efficiency of human imagination. You follow the winding streets away from the clearing where the falling blade once struck, toward the fortified gates of the town, where the air grows heavier, thick with the scent of sweat, wet stone, and something sharper, the metallic tang of iron left to mark a warning. Here, the punishment is both literal and symbolic, heads displayed on spikes, a practice designed to terrify, inform, and impress upon everyone the absolute reach of authority. A low wooden scaffold sits just outside the gate, the supports darkened from exposure to sun and rain, and atop each a severed head rests, mounted to face the road like grim sentinels. The first head is familiar, the face pale and frozen in an expression of shock and resignation, eyes staring blankly at passers-by. You notice the subtle difference between the preserved faces, the way the executioner has propped each to face the most crowded path, ensuring maximum visibility, each a silent sermon carved in flesh and bone. The crowd gathers at a cautious distance, whispering and pointing, the combination of fear and fascination hanging heavy in the cool air. Today's condemned is a petty thief, caught looting in broad daylight, and his head is next in line, awaiting the justice that will make his crime permanently visible. A mainstream historical fact strikes you as you take in the scene. Displaying severed heads on spikes or gates was a common practice across medieval Europe, from England to France to the Holy Roman Empire, often reserved for traitors, murderers, and thieves. The goal was straightforward: deterrence through spectacle, an unmistakable visual that the consequences of crime were both immediate and eternal. These heads often remained on display for days, sometimes weeks, until decay forced their removal, a constant reminder of law and power. You notice the way the wind shifts, carrying a faintly sweet odor of decomposition mixed with the damp scent of stone and timber, and it strikes you how effectively fear can be spread with so few elements: wood, iron, and the remnants of life. The condemned man is led forward by two guards, his wrists tied behind his back, head lowered as though already understanding the fate awaiting him. A fringe tidbit from a Flemish record notes that some towns decorated the spikes with small symbols or inscriptions, not to honor the condemned but to serve as moral commentary. Lines like, "Let this teach all who wander into sin," or "Justice tastes bitter," Some towns even allowed children to touch the spikes, a way to educate the young in obedience and caution, ensuring that fear was passed down like folklore. Scholars debate the extent to which these displays were deterrents versus instruments of psychological manipulation. One camp insists that the practice effectively instilled caution in the populace, a tangible warning of what awaited transgressors. Another argues that the heads were more about asserting the authority of rulers, demonstrating dominion through grotesque artistry, rather than serving as a practical deterrent. Standing here, you sense both arguments. The lesson is etched in bone and sinew, yet the political theater is equally clear. The executioner, a tall man with a calm expression, lifts the condemned's head with practiced precision, positioning it above the first spike. The rope and lever mechanism creak, the man's body dangling briefly before the head finds its place. There is a muffled gasp from some spectators, a subtle shiver moving through the crowd. The head is secured, angled so that anyone approaching the gate cannot avoid its gaze. The expression frozen mid-breath, mid-fear, mid-life. The condemned, now disembodied, seems to command more attention than the living, a macabre authority that reminds the villagers of the cost of lawlessness. You notice how quickly the fear settles in, even among those not directly involved in crime. The sight of a familiar face, once a neighbor or a tradesman, now impaled on wood, communicates more effectively than any sermon or statute. The wind carries whispers along the street, warnings, superstitions, interpretations, prayers, each reinforcing the presence of authority. The crowd begins to drift, leaving the remaining heads to glimmer under the pale afternoon sun, silent yet screaming through memory and anticipation. The condemned man's body is removed, but his head remains, a stark reminder that in this society punishment extends beyond life itself, living on to influence those who see it. As you step back from the gates, the smell and sight leave a lingering impression, mingling with the faint scent of wet stone and earth. The heads on spikes are more than deterrents. They are statements, stories, symbols of a world where crime could be measured in the permanence of display. You imagine the next traveler approaching the town, eyes drawn instinctively to the row of faces, learning a lesson before even speaking a word. It is a calculus of fear and memory, brutal yet efficient, a tangible history that communicates authority more loudly than parchment or proclamation ever could. The evening deepens, shadows stretching across the street, and the wooden spikes stand as silent witnesses to a justice designed not only to punish but to endure, reminding all who passed that law in the medieval world was as permanent as wood and iron, and as unforgettable as the eyes that once looked upon life with hope, now frozen in eternity. You leave the shadowed gates behind and walk through quiet streets where the scent of rain-soaked stone mingles with smoke from distant hearths, and you realize that even the darkest punishments are accompanied by rituals of closure, small moments where mercy and terror intersect. At the center of a dimly lit chamber inside the town's keep, the condemned sits at a rough wooden table, hands resting on the worn surface, a bowl of thin gruel and a hunk of bread before him, the last meal. The room smells faintly of soup, candle wax and fear, and a single lantern swings gently above, casting shifting shadows across the stone walls. A confessor sits across from him, hands folded over a simple prayer book, eyes calm yet piercing, offering both absolution and instruction as the man eats. Tonight, the condemned is a petty thief and a gossip, someone who has transgressed both law and social order. The last meal, simple and cold, serves as sustenance, ritual, and a final pause before the world claims him, reminding both prisoner and witnesses that even in finality, routine and tradition persist. A mainstream historical fact anchors the scene. Offering a last meal was a common practice across medieval Europe, codified in some regions as a legal or customary rite. Clergy often accompanied the condemned to provide spiritual counsel, confession, and the hope of salvation, ensuring that even those destined for execution had the opportunity to reconcile with God. In some accounts, the nature of the meal varied by status and crime. Kings or nobles might receive elaborate dishes, while commoners were offered the barest sustenance necessary to sustain them until their sentence was carried out. The ritual served both practical and symbolic purposes, grounding the final moments in humanity before the performance of justice became complete. The condemned eats quietly, chewing slowly, listening to the confessor murmur prayers, the words rising in gentle cadence over the faint drip of water from a nearby spout. Each spoonful, each swallow, seems deliberate, a quiet resistance to the inevitability that awaits outside the chamber doors. A fringe tidbit from a late 15th century chronicle notes that some prisoners attempted to save a portion of their last meal, either hiding a crust under a sleeve or slipping a sip of ale into their pocket, as a small act of defiance or superstition. People believed that carrying a fragment of sustenance beyond death might appease spirits or ward off evil, though there is no evidence it ever altered the outcome. Scholars debate whether these customs were intended for psychological comfort or purely as ritualistic formalities. One interpretation argues that the practice of the last meal and confession reinforced social order, providing a structured pause in which society could reaffirm moral authority and ritual closure. Another perspective suggests the ritual offered a brief window of empathy, allowing observers to witness the condemned as human, even as the machinery of punishment awaited. You feel both truths here. The meal is sustenance, the confession is absolution, yet all of it is framed by the inevitability of the law. The confessor leans forward, voice low, asking the condemned to reflect on his sins, encouraging him to speak aloud, to confess fully before facing the outside world. He responds haltingly, voice trembling yet clear, speaking both truth and supposition, a mixture of remorse, fear, and faint hope that words might soften the severity of what is to come. The meal ends quietly, the bowl scraped clean, crumbs swept into the folds of the cloth, and the confessor murmurs the final prayer. You notice how the condemned's posture has shifted slightly, shoulders less rigid, eyes less frantic. The ritual has offered a moment of human grace within the machinery of punishment. The guards step forward, hands firm yet restrained, signaling that it is time to leave the chamber. Every step echoes on the stone floors, as the man is led toward the courtyard, where the final act of justice will take place, and you realize that the combination of last meal and confession is both pause and prelude, preparing the condemned, the witnesses, and even the executioners for what follows. The corridor outside is cold, the air carrying faint scents of night and distant fires, and the condemned's breathing is steady but tense. You see the careful attention of the confessor lingering in his eyes, the subtle gesture of blessing as he releases his charge to the hands of the guards. The ritual, while brief, has reinforced both human connection and societal authority, a dual function that medieval law always sought to balance. Outside, the first stars appear, glimmering faintly through the mist, casting delicate light on cobblestones slick with evening dew. The courtyard awaits, and you sense the tension shift as the final moments approach. The condemned stands tall, bolstered perhaps by the simplicity of a meal and the words of a confessor, even as the weight of inevitability presses upon him. Observers line the space with a mixture of solemnity and anticipation, aware that the ritual has ended and the law will now be enacted in its starkest form. The silence is profound, broken only by the distant whisper of wind through the gate and the faint creak of wooden beams above. In this stillness, the final lesson resonates, that even in an age of cruelty and strict justice, moments of reflection, nourishment, and spiritual counsel were woven into the process, reminding all involved of both mortality and the enduring rituals of humanity. The condemned is led toward the next stage, a faint glimmer of understanding passing through the gathered crowd, a shared acknowledgement of ritual, consequence, and the delicate interplay of fear, tradition, and conscience. You follow the cobbled streets from the quiet chamber, the echoes of the last meal, and whispered confessions still lingering in your mind, toward the large open square at the center of town, where the scaffold stands tall against the gray sky. The structure is simple yet imposing. Thick timber posts supporting a platform, a trapdoor in the center, and ropes coiled neatly alongside a frame meant to hang or bind. The condemned, now prepared from the ritual of last meal and confession, is led forward by guards, each step echoing on the stone streets, reverberating through the square where villagers have already gathered. They come for justice, for confirmation of law, for spectacle, and in some cases simply to witness the inevitable. Their faces pale, eyes wide, hands folded or clutching garments in anticipation. The condemned is a young thief, small of frame but tall in resolve, standing at the edge of the scaffold and facing the crowd that will witness the final act of his punishment. You notice the symmetry of it all. Platform, crowd, condemned, executioners, every element arranged with deliberate precision to convey authority and moral certainty. A mainstream historical fact reminds you that public executions in medieval Europe were highly regulated events, often announced days in advance so that townsfolk could gather and observe. The scaffold was more than a platform, it was a stage for morality, demonstrating consequences in the clearest terms possible. For thieves, traitors, and those guilty of serious crimes, the scaffold provided a space where law, spectacle, and communal reassurance intersected. The condemned is secured, feet strapped, hands bound, and the executioner checks ropes and traps with meticulous care. The crowd murmurs in response to each adjustment, their attention unwavering, aware that any misstep could disrupt the lesson that the spectacle is designed to teach. A fringe tidbit recalls a case in 15th century France, in which executioners decorated the scaffold with banners depicting the sins of the condemned, turning the event into a moral tableau for townsfolk and travelers alike. Scholars continue to debate whether the emphasis of such events was deterrence, social cohesion, or simply theater. The evidence suggests a mixture of all three, with psychological impact weighing as heavily as physical punishment. The trapdoor is readied. The condemned is given a final nod by the executioner, whose face betrays nothing, and the crowd grows still in anticipation. Each breath feels amplified, every heartbeat a drum. The condemned's gaze scans the audience, some familiar, some strangers, all witnesses to the enforcement of law and the embodiment of consequence. The platform creaks slightly under weight, the ropes taut and ready, and the wind shifts, carrying the scent of wet stone and damp wood, mixing with faint smoke from torches along the perimeter. The executioner signals, and the mechanism is triggered. The trapdoor opens, the condemned drops, and the motion is swift, almost abstract in its detachment from fear. The crowd reacts immediately. Some gasp, some cross themselves, others remain frozen in collective witness. The physical act of punishment is complete in a heartbeat, but the impact is far greater, lingering in the minds of every observer as both moral lesson and visual testament to the authority of law. A quirky detail emerges from chronicles in England, noting that sometimes executioners would release animals, hawks or crows during scaffold events, creating distraction, emphasizing spectacle, and reinforcing the symbolic dominance of authority over life. The birds would circle, adding movement and drama, their presence an additional layer of ritualized reinforcement. The crowd would interpret this as omens, morality made tangible and performative, while the condemned could only stand in the weight of expectation and inevitability. Scholars debate the significance of such embellishments. Were they merely decorative, a way to maintain attention, or did they serve a deeper psychological function, heightening fear and reinforcing communal values? Observing the aftermath, you sense the truth is a blend of both. As the crowd slowly disperses, the condemned is removed from view, the scaffold left empty yet resonating with the energy of the event, the timbers warm from sun and the weight of human focus. The square quiets, conversations shifting to the mundane, the mill, the market, supper, while the lesson persists invisibly, embedded in memory. You notice the small details, the way torches catch shadows, the slight tremble of ropes, the arrangement of planks that once bore weight and life, and you realize that the scaffold is more than wood and nails. It is a vessel for authority, a physical manifestation of consequence, and a canvas upon which society paints its moral certainty. Every gaze, every step, every deliberate sound has been accounted for, ensuring that the event communicates order beyond the spoken word. The sky above deepens, stars appearing faintly through drifting clouds, casting delicate light across the stone and wood, a final moment of beauty overlaying the grim purpose of the scaffold. The day ends with the quiet hum of the town settling into night, the square empty, the lesson lingering, and the structure waiting silently for the next act of law, consequence, and human observation. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and as you settle into a chair or lie back, breathing slowly and deliberately, you can let the weight of everything you've witnessed begin to dissolve, noticing how your body sinks a little deeper, shoulders releasing tension they didn't even realize they were holding, the echo of cobblestones and scaffold creaks fading into a gentle internal rhythm. In this quiet, you remember the stocks, the pillories, the branks, the iron chair, the rat barrel, and the scaffold itself. Each punishment a meditation on fear, obedience, and the human imagination's capacity to shape both pain and learning. And though the cruelty was extreme and the creativity of suffering at times almost absurd, you can also recognize the enduring truth that every society seeks order, however misguided, and that our fascination with control, morality, and consequence is as old as memory itself, woven into the fabric of villages, castles, marketplaces, and ships, stretching across centuries, touching every street, courtyard, and square that once bore witness to spectacle and fear alike. And in reflecting on it now, you realize that even the darkest parts of history can teach empathy, patience, and the quiet understanding that human beings, despite capacity for cruelty, also possess resilience, ingenuity, and the ability to endure and bear witness without losing sight of themselves. And as your thoughts drift over the images of heretics, thieves, scolds, and scholars, you can feel the rhythm of medieval life slowing, the intensity of observation softening into narrative, and the sensory details, the scent of tar, the cold of iron, the creak of wood, the distant call of birds, the subtle warmth of fire become a gentle background against which you can now reflect calmly, letting your mind wander through the layers of human experience, the lessons of morality, justice, and endurance coalescing into an understanding that is both historical and personal. And as you think of the individuals whose lives were shaped by fear, authority, and consequence, you also remember the absurdity, the creativity, and even the humor that threaded through it all. Because even in suffering, human beings found rhythm, ritual, and sometimes a faint glimmer of agency. And this reflection allows you to soften your perspective, breathing with intention, letting awareness of time, place, and story wash over you. Each exhale a small acknowledgement of endurance, each inhale a gentle acceptance that history, in all its severity and strangeness, teaches lessons that transcend cruelty, and as the mental images of punishment fade into memory, replaced by the quiet hum of your own breath, you feel a sense of closure, the rhythm of storytelling and reflection merging, allowing your body and mind to relax more fully, knowing that the stories, while vivid, are safely contained in imagination, and as eyelids grow heavy, thoughts slowing to a gentle drift, the final understanding settles softly, comforting and enduring, leaving a lasting impression of both awe and calm, as the journey through medieval punishment comes to its gentle conclusion, and you realize that in witnessing history, even its darkest chapters, you can carry forward not just images of cruelty, but awareness, perspective, and a quiet reassurance until finally your mind, body, and attention can ease completely into rest, and the last words of the story echo gently in your imagination. Sweet dreams,